welcome back to part 2 of our breakdown of the Breath of the Wild trailer music. Now, I realized last time when I released the part 1, I forgot to do a quick general overview of the percussion, so I'm going to do that real quick before we get into some of the more advanced nitpicking of things. We're going to go really into depth with some of the more intimate piano writing sections, and we're going to go into the winds as well, because I feel like Legend of Zelda, they always found a way to pronounce their woodwind sections or their solo winds very well, so we're going to go really into depth with those as well. Really quick, first we're going to go into the percussion. Now, the percussion for this is very simplistic, as opposed to some of the more advanced pieces we've analyzed on our channel so far. It only has, I would say, standard drum kit instruments. It has a bass drum, a snare drum, and a variety of cymbals. And then it also has a timpani in here as well as these tubular bells, which are tonal percussion. They're just doubling up some of the melodic lines and a little bit of harmonic emphasis here and there. If you just listen to some of the sections here, I'll play it through and you can hear how the percussion is affecting the track. I'm going to actually turn the percussion up a little bit so that you can hear it better in the mix. So you can hear pretty simplistic percussion line. It is mostly backed up by that snare drum and our bass drums and the timpani. Timpani and the snare drum, I would say, would be our main percussion elements for this entire track. The timpani gives you that really, really impactful low and mid end, whereas the snare gives you main rhythm and reinforces with the timpanis. The tubular bells, as you heard and possibly saw, there are mostly just there for harmonic reinforcement, which you hear a lot closer to the end when they're doing the more melodic line, and over here they're following that piano melody. And then you have the bass drum, which, similar to the timpani, is just providing some low-end reinforcement, and it's helping drive the overall piece forward. Really, really critical piece is your low-end percussion. You always have to make sure that that's on point, and that's helping drive your tracks forward. And it really did a great job here where it blends the timpani and the bass drum together. And they did a really great job of alternating it in and out. As you heard, when it went into those lower down piano sections, which we explored last week in our other breakdown video, they took all the percussion out. They really made it really emotional by focusing solely on the piano and helping the piano get all the attention it deserved. If you add in a whole bunch of really big low-end percussion, when you just transitioned out of a section with a whole bunch of big percussion like that, it really takes away from the emotional aspect of it, and it would take away from the piano as well. So they did a really great job when they fleshed this piece out, writing out the percussion for it. Legend of Zelda, I've always felt have been all the composers who've ever done any of the Zelda works always did really great jobs of focusing on the more fantasy aspect of it when they incorporate all of those winds and the piano. The strings and the choir are, I would say, would be our second most important sections in this track. The choir possibly a little bit more than the strings, as they help emphasize the emotion that is laid out by the piano and the woodwinds. And then the strings are there mostly, as you can see, they do a lot of sort of ostinato and run patterns, and they do a little bit of melodic emphasizing over here. They're very, very important for helping flesh out the whole orchestra and providing the rest of the harmonic spectrum that it would be lacking otherwise. However, I feel like the winds and the strings and these harp runs here kind of help flesh out the piece as a whole. It would not be nearly as impactful if you took out the piano as opposed to the strings or the brass. Even as you are listening through the track, just listening through the intro, you can hear it starts off with the piano first, with this really, really big bass and hit, which is an E, which we explored last week in our first walkthrough video. You get this really big boom. And then you get the harp. So overall, I would say the piano and the harp already dominating the track, right? And then it goes even further with introducing this piano melody. Whereas if this was written out in a string section, it wouldn't be nearly as impactful or emotional as they made it sound with all the expressiveness in the pianos and the harps. If you were to write this out in a string section, if I just copy this down and I mute the piano, you can hear it doesn't have the same emotion. It's not as emotional. It is more of sort of I wouldn't say it's like a background melody, but it's not as impactful as the piano option that they went with, and it really helps carry forward the overall audio theme of The Legend of Zelda as well. They also help keep the overall dark aspect in the beginning with these first few notes, because they're just doing octaves and that kind of first chord harmonic. They just have an E down here, you have E and B here, which is your first and your fifth of your first chord, and then they bring in some descending line, and then all the way down to that fifth note again, which really keeps it dark because you're just emphasizing that power chord, that E to B, that kind of more minor harmony alongside the rest of the instruments that are playing. And then you go over to the oboe here, which brings in kind of the more happier aspect of things, or the more majestic. And then you go into this really, really big section with the brass, which really brings the emphasis forward. We're going to just go through this really quick chord progression they do here because I find it absolutely fascinating. Now, whereas I would say the main key for the song is, of course, your E minor key with your F sharp, they do a really, really interesting transition here where instead of emphasizing the E minor, they actually transition over to starting to emphasize the G major to go from that really, really dark aspect over to your relative major, staying in the same relative key. And now you have all this major emphasis here. Now it starts off with the minor emphasis with your B, E, B. And then it descends down to the G, and all of a sudden everything turned more heroic, more majestic. Instead of that really dark theme, you now all of a sudden are starting to enter the more heroic era of the song. And they made this transition very well because they started off with this power relation between the E and the B, and then you went up to the B again, and from there you just did a couple walking down notes down to this G, and it sounds beautiful. Then they transition over to this C chord, the C major chord. Now it's missing its fifth note, but it's keeping that major third relation between the C and the E, which in comparison with the G major chord is a very, very major, very happy progression. If I just bring in the piano and I play that G major, you have this, and then all of a sudden you're going to a C, which is that. And it's a very, very major progression. It's also could set the stage for a transition into the C chord because you're going from the fifth of a C to a home chord C, but it's not the home chord because they keep it in the E minor, G major key, which is a transition in the next chord where they have an F A C chord. And then they go back to your EG here, again, missing the fifth because they're trying to focus on more of the emotion. When you pair, when you're writing out your triad chords or your bass triad chords, if you include the fifth is a very, very unique note to overemphasize because it can actually take away some of the emotion of your chord if you emphasize it too much. A lot of the harmonic classes that I've seen out there, they actually emphasize doubling either your home chord or your third over your fifth because that'll help. So if you double the first note of your chord, you're emphasizing the bass of the chord. You're helping strengthen it. And if you emphasize the third more, you're helping produce more emotion. And they're doing that a lot here because you can see they doubled the C, E, they doubled the F here for the FAC chord, and then here they doubled the G, which is your third. And then they did this really, really interesting, I'd call it a transitional section really, is all it is. They bring in those really, really fast string runs that are constantly rising up. And then to contradict those rising string runs, they actually have a brass line here that descends until it lands on a BDF chord, which you can see here if I just bring this down, BDF, it's in its first inversion. Now once again, you have the piano emphasizing it along with those strings, you have the piano line constantly rising, and you also have the winds doubling that. So you actually have the same line repeated many, many times in several octaves. The piano is playing this line here, and the strings are also playing this line and this line. So you have it really, really emphasizing that ascending run, while those really powerful horns do the descending run and counter it, and it makes for a really interesting development. Now this piano section here with the choir, very beautiful and also very, very interesting. They really, really nailed the counter movement on this piece amazingly. If I just take this out and just focus on the piano, you can see that beautifully. For this section, you have the melody starting really, really high. It goes, again, emphasizing that E. You're focusing everything around that E note to really emphasize your key. Starting with the B, going down to the E, and immediately jumping up an octave. And while you're hitting this really high note and climbing, you have these notes climbing here as well, but as they're climbing, you also start to descend. You have this really, really powerful arpeggiated upline that is, once it gets into the higher section here, it actually just starts going up in your scale. As you can see here, when it hits this D, it just starts going G, A, F, G, A, B, and then it jumps up to this D, and while it's climbing, it meets this seventh chord that the melody plays. And underneath this seventh chord, you again have this really powerful run that starts on your E at the bottom, jumps up to your B, and then just starts going up in your scale before trying to run back down to another run here. Now, there's not a lot of set-in-stone harmonic progression in this beginning part. We just have these runs and these very, very beautiful arpeggiated chords. But when it brings in the brass section and the strings, all of a sudden you can see some more harmonic movement. It brings in these low, low notes in the strings that help emphasize the overall emotion. As you can see, we have a B here, and we have a D up here with it, along with these E's, and that's just helping emphasize kind of more like the bottom note. The lowest note on your current piece, wherever you are in the song, will tend to dictate the emotion of where it's going. That's generally what your bass will do, and it's helping emphasize that as we play through. If you listen for these low notes, this low double bass note, it starts off with that low B and that climbs up to that C when it hits this chord, and you can hear how that low C helps carry the emotion forward, and that jumps back down to the low B. Now from there we have these just bass triads along with the brass, which is doing some suspended movement and helping carry the melody above it along. As you can see, it's kind of doing a sort of counter melody or a harmony to the main melody as you go this E to this D, this B to this D, an octave E, a C and B, and it's keeping the same rhythm alongside the piano, which is up top, with these arpeggiated chords playing out the bottom. And this just really helps carry the movement forward. And then you just have these mid-range strings. They're kind of just filling out the spectrum, and it tricks your ear into just hearing the progression really grow, and you're not really hearing the intimate details anymore. Now, as you can hear, it kind of gets really triumphant and then kind of dark again before it gets into this thing. Like the very last notes are kind of dark. This could be part of the harmony, but I feel like the brass and the dark notes that they are portraying really help it along. You do the standard B minor chord, B, D, F, and then you have an E, G, B chord, which is also another minor. And then you move up to this F, A, C chord, which is, you'll notice in this little section here, they've completely gotten rid of that F sharp, and they've kind of gone back to just a standard C scale, even when the F over here was sharped. So what this does is this would be kind of like a modal changeout. They did a very slight modal change where they just change one note in their scale, and it really helps the emotion develop as it heads into this dark section, because you have this major chord, and then above it you have even more major emphasis with G and D, but it sounds so dark. And then immediately it goes back into having that F sharped, and you're emphasizing this E note in your bass alongside this A. So you could think about this as it switches into having a completely other harmonic emphasis, and now it's emphasizing an ACE chord with the first note of the chord and the fifth note emphasize that fifth note really driving that power of the A chord together. And with these sort of ostinato woods and strings playing at the top, it really helps drive your section forward. Now you can see here, we have sort of this pedal note all the way through, this E note down here. And you can see that there's a direct dissonance to it right beside it here with the tuba, but the tuba is mimicking a line above it. So it doesn't seem out of place. It doesn't necessarily sound like a heavy dissonance because it's mimicking what's happening an octave above it. But if you were to do something like this just by itself, it would sound completely out of place. It would sound like this, which is very wobbly, not necessarily pleasant, but it helps give you that dark feeling for this section as well, before it transitions into this section over here with the really emphasized woodwind, piano, and string melody all working together in a very nice melodic progression. Now, it's really interesting how they developed this melody, because if you listen to it, it has these, or even if you just look at it, it has these really interesting emphases on eighth notes here, where it goes from kind of like your home note, and then it always dips down a few notes below in the scale before jumping up to another sort of main note. And as you can hear, the melody itself is just kind of going like this. But it adds in these eighth note jumps that really help keep the interest going. It makes the melody a lot more interesting. So instead of what we had before, it's now doing this. And again, for the really triumphant heroic theme, they bring in the major aspect of the key instead of the minor. So while you have this E note playing down here, kind of emphasizing the E minor of it all, you have this G and this D and this other G up here, which really emphasize the major in the progression instead of the minor. Now after this, we transition into another piano section, which, as opposed to our first one, instead of doing the arpeggiated chords in the bass and having a sort of overlaying melody, it kind of does the arpeggiation for the melody, and then it transitions to having a small arpeggio on the bass, but then it just turns into standard sort of chordal progression. Now it shifts into some more emotional progression here as well. You can hear it has a sort of FAC in the bottom here, and it has your G over here, so it's going from major to major. And then it has your first chord, your EB chord here, with the G missing, with the third missing. As you can see here, it's got an A chord, ACE, but with the C missing. Over here, same thing, except now we've brought that A up. Now you have a BDF with the D missing, then you have octave Cs, DFA with the F missing, EGB with the F missing again, octave A chord, and then you have a BDF chord again with the D chord missing. So it kind of transitions between just building these two chords out as well in the upper section, whereas the bottom, you just have sort of these two main chords. You have the F and the E, whereas in the up top you have the ACE and the BDF chord. In essence, with this last section, with the E and the B down here, and then having the BDF, it's essentially playing out a seventh chord, because now instead of just having that EGB chord, now you have EGB without the D above it and then the F. So you're playing out a ninth chord, sorry. And then you go into a darker section again. With even more descending lines. Descending bass lines are a kind of trademark if you're ever writing out a section that is going to be dark or representative of evil, such as this kind of section is. A descending bass line will always kind of spell doom. It just... right? And they did that very, very well here. They started off with their E, their 1, and then they descended down to their 7 and their 6. Along with these pedal notes up top, which keep the suspense rolling even as everything else around it changes. You have all these wind and string inflections up top, which are now starting to have sort of movement and runs, and they're emphasizing your melody. And you start to have more chordal progressions happening. Once you really break down what's happening in a track, you can kind of understand how they are actually writing out for the emotion that they're trying to portray. You can see here, again, they have an EGB chord with the melody emphasized with the E, and then they transition to a GBD chord with a B in the bass. They have a huge D emphasis here as a transitional. Really transitional epic feel as it transitions down. As you can see, this upper line here is traveling down, mimicking what's happening up top, and then you have a movement up into this condensed section with the GBD chord. Now you can hear how powerful that choir is in that section. The choir voices, the SATB voices, are really important to how this track progressed because similar to the winds and the piano, they really drive this section forward, as well as a lot of other sections. You can hear back here in the, one of the previous sections we went through, they help give off this epic run up as we transition. And then over here again, when the percussion falls out, when that snare drum and that bass drum fall out, the choir really takes over. And they're actually really emphasizing the main harmony here as well. As you can see, we have EGB, we have GBD, and then we're transitioning down to this EGB again in its original position. As you can hear and see, the harmonic progression is actually insanely simple. You're going from your tonic, your home chord, your 1 chord, to a 5 chord, back down to your 1 chord. Very simple, very easy to write out. However, how they orchestrated it out, it just sounds beautiful and extremely complicated to your ear until you get the MIDI or you get the sheet music and you start breaking it down. And then you have DFA, which is actually your 7th chord, but because it is in a minor key, it's a major, which gives you that very major run up. And then you have DFA widened out. As you can see, they took the A that was here and they just put it up an octave. So they're widening it out for their big, one of their big climax sections where they have this A, this F, this A, and this B. And if I bring in some of the other sections to the MIDI here to view, it is actually extremely widened out because they add in even more octaves. They add in these bass runs down below. It sounds... just beautiful. And they have 3 octaves of this B being played out with nothing between them, which really emphasizes the power of it because you have all these octaves playing out. And then you have this A down here and this A here, which are kind of contradicting your B, as well as these walk downs, which are kind of helping emphasize the climax and kind of emphasizing the doomer aspect of it as well. And then you have the piano with this beautiful little lick and this harp with this big run up before we get into the final climax. Now, if we just go back to the choir, we can once again really break down the harmony of it, because the SATB will generally be playing out kind of like your more based, broken down harmony of it all, whereas all your other instruments may be playing more complex or more orchestrated and spread out versions of it. So once again, when you come into this epic section here, the very last bit of it, you can see, once again, it starts off with your home E chord, very, very similar to what happened over here, and it even sounds similar. However, it sounds different because we had this little piano pause in between the sections here. And that kind of helps your ears and your brain refresh, not forget what it sounded like before, but all of a sudden this new section sounds different and just as interesting as the section before it. This is also in part to the different orchestration of it. If I once again include some of the more various instruments, you can see that this section over here, where it first did this big E chord, it doesn't look the same as over here. We have much more bass density, and we have different notes for the melody. So the melody is different, which helps keep the section interesting, but also you have a more dense collection of notes emphasizing the harmony. So we start off with our E chord, and we immediately jump to our fifth chord, our G, but we're climbing, we're making it dramatic. We are rising up above, as one would say, and we're really doing that big heroic final climax. So we go from our E up to our fifth, and then we have an A, C, E chord with the C sharpened. Now, instead of it sounding like an E, G, A progression in the E scale, which would sound like this, so instead of it sounding like that, we now have it sounding like this. Because now our A is major instead of minor, because we sharpened the third, which is another modal change. To what scale it's borrowing the chord from is up to debate. It could be in any scale that has an irregular A, regular E, and a sharp C, which could be A major, who knows? And it really gives off this heroic feel because, once again, you're climbing and you're making it dramatic. You're emphasizing the major aspect. Now, if I were a crazy man and I decided to go in and make all those sharp Cs, bring them down to just regular old natural Cs, it would not sound as triumphant. It would probably still have a fair amount of that triumphant feeling because it is emphasized in the melody. And we'll just bring all these Cs down to a natural C, and you can hear it's not quite as triumphant. It is still very triumphant, and that is emphasized in great part by the melody and the climbing chords. The chords are still climbing. However, if we pop this C up to C sharp and make that whole chord major, it greatly emphasizes the climbing. It strengthens it. And I feel like this is this small decision, however small or intricate or just slightly detailed it may be, is what makes the composer of this piece just very, very genius and talented. Is he already made it sound very, very epic and climbing and dramatic, but he emphasized it even more by just deciding to step out of his natural chosen key just a little bit to help and bring it in and make it really stronger for this final climax. Now we're going to go back to looking at the choir again, because the choir is doing a great job of just letting us take a quick overview of the general melody that's going on. So as we're going from that E chord to our G to our major A, it then brings us back home, kind of brings us down a little bit with a C major chord, which you can see it's just a C, G written out in your 4-note SATB choir. And it kind of brings it down a little bit. We got really, really big and epic, brought it down just a little bit, not even that much, just a little bit. We brought everything kind of back towards the center of our harmonic spectrum. And then we went from a C major back to our home chord, our EGB in first inversion, to our FAC chord, another major chord. We're keeping things very, very major here with just some minor tones to help keep the interest. And then for the big final climax, we have this big walks. We go from FAC, we got a B down here, and big epic finale on our E chord with an A in the bass to kind of emphasize the fantasy aspect, because we're keeping that out of the triad note in. So you can see when I bring all the other instruments in as well, we still don't have that fifth in here. We're still missing the G, and it's keeping it really, really, really powerful as we're doing these walks down and going into our last little section. And we have a lot of dissonances here as well. We have an A and a B right beside each other, an A and a B right beside each other again. But we also have lots of octave Bs. We have a B here, a B. We have 4 octaves of the B laid out across the entire spectrum over all of our orchestration. And it really, really makes it powerful, because oddly enough, you're emphasizing that fifth again. And it's a really, really weird note to emphasize a lot of the time, because when you overemphasize it, you're just really, really bringing in a lot of that power of the chord. And sometimes having all that power for the chord is not a great idea, but they did it so well here, because you also have these 2 octave E's up top, which are helping you bring the chord back home. And you have these dissonances here, this A and this A and this D, which are dissonancing themselves with the B's and helping kind of bring together the more fantasy feel, because you're adding in these sevenths, and I believe the A is actually the 11th of the E chord. So it's really, really flushing it out. And then you have this beautiful little piano arpeggio at the end to just wrap it all up in a nice little bow, and it's really, really beautiful. So that's probably where we're going to leave this walkthrough, or this breakdown of this piece. A lot of really, really simple harmony, and a lot of it, it's really just a lot of movements between your 1 chord to your 5 chord, with a couple other interesting chords here and there, and that one or 2 odd modal changes. Now I'm going to include the MIDI in the description of this video, just like I did with the last walkthrough, where we just did a quick general overview of kind of like how the movement progresses. I highly recommend just download the MIDI. Just look through it and learn for yourself how these pieces are orchestrated out and what makes them sound just so amazing. It can be really educational and extremely helpful if you're trying to write any sort of music, not just something in this style, not just something in the style of Zelda, but the learning from this piece or any piece can greatly improve your compositional skills. So next week, we're going to be doing our sidechaining compression video to wrap up our compression series. And from there, who knows? I'll keep you guys in the loop, but it's going to be a couple more videos on composition breakdowns. I haven't figured out what piece we're doing yet, but it's going to be a good one. Download the MIDI below. Make sure to go check out my socials. It really helps a lot if you just hit that sub button. I'll see you guys next week. Have a good one.